$909.1 billion. That's how much goods and services crossed between the United States and Canada in 2024, according to the U.S. Trade Representative. Today, January 5th, 2026, approximately 90% of that trade continues flowing duty-free thanks to one critical exemption. But in July, just 6 months from now, that exemption faces its biggest test. Because when Canada and the United States sit down for the mandatory review of the USMCA trade agreement, President Trump has already signaled he's willing to walk away from the entire deal if he doesn't get what he wants. I spent 3 days analyzing trade data, reviewing tariff timelines, examining industry impacts, and studying diplomatic documents to understand what actually happened in 2025 and what's scheduled for 2026. Not speculation, not predictions, just documented facts about the largest trade war between allied nations in modern history, and why the next 6 months will determine whether North America's economic integration survives or collapses. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Trump's tariff campaign evolved from 25% in February to 35% by August 2025. You'll see the documented CUSMA exemption that saved Canada from recession, and why experts say it's absolutely at risk in 2026. And you'll know why this matters far beyond Canada and the U.S., as the world watches to see if decades of free trade agreements can be torn up by a single administration. But first, let me show you something that reveals just how unprecedented this situation is. Canada sends 75% of everything it exports to the United States. In 2024, according to Statistics Canada, Canada's merchandise trade surplus with the U.S. reached $102.3 billion. Nearly $3.6 billion worth of goods and services cross the border every single day. This is the most integrated binational economy on Earth. Auto parts crossing the border multiple times during manufacturing, energy pipelines delivering 4 million barrels of crude daily, electricity transmission lines powering cities on both sides. That level of integration doesn't just get disrupted without massive consequences. Let's start with documented facts about how we got here. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. On February 1st, his 11th day in office, Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on most goods from Canada and Mexico, citing concerns about fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration across both borders. According to the White House fact sheet published February 2nd, the tariffs would apply to all articles except Canadian energy resources, which faced a 10% tariff. Trump's justification was explicit: until the crisis is alleviated regarding drugs and illegal aliens crossing from Canada. Canada's response came swiftly. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced retaliatory tariffs. 25% on, say, $30 billion worth of American goods, set to expand to, say, $155 billion after 3 weeks. But on February 3rd, one day before implementation, both leaders negotiated a 30-day pause. During that pause, Canada acted. According to Reuters reporting from September 18, 2025, Canada expanded the Safe Third Country Agreement across the entire border, requiring asylum seekers to claim refuge in the first country they enter. The data shows results. Canada returned 282 asylum seekers to the U.S. in the first 8 months of 2025, a 32% increase from 2024. In July 2025 alone, 789 people were turned back, a monthly record for the decade. Canada also appointed a fentanyl czar and increased border security spending by $200 million in the 2025-26 budget, hiring 200 new border agents. These were concrete measures responding to Trump's stated concerns. Despite these actions, Trump escalated. On July 10, 2025, Trump sent an official letter to Canada announcing a tariff increase to 35%, according to multiple sources, including the Gazeta do Povo report. The letter explicitly linked the tariffs to the failure of Canada to prevent drugs from entering the United States. But here's where the story gets critical. Throughout all of this, approximately 90% of Canadian exports continued entering the U.S. duty-free. How? The CUSMA exemption, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, called USMCA in the U.S., CUSMA in Canada, that replaced NAFTA in July 2020, allows companies to prove their products meet North American content rules, demonstrating the goods were substantially made in Canada, the U.S., or Mexico. Products that qualify for CUSMA compliance avoid Trump's blanket tariffs entirely. According to trade lawyer William Pellerin, Quoted in multiple Canadian media reports, this compliance mechanism became a workaround, allowing the Trump administration to maintain its tough tariff rhetoric while preserving the integrated North American supply chains that are essential to U.S. industry. The numbers tell the story. According to the Bank of Canada and Oxford Economics data cited in multiple December 2025 reports, effective tariff rates on Canadian goods rose from practically 0% at the start of 2025 to approximately 5.9 to 6.3% by year end. That's significant, but nowhere near the 35% headline rate, precisely because of CUSMA compliance. Tony Stillo, Director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics, told Canadian media in late December, earlier in 2025, the firm was forecasting a sharp recession would hit Canada in the wake of tariff disruption, but the CUSMA exemption and Ottawa ending the bulk of its counter tariffs in September pulled the economy out of quicksand. Canada's decision to suspend most retaliatory tariffs effective September 1st, 2025, was strategic. According to the official order in Council, Canada removed tariffs on Phase 1 goods, in effect since March 4th, and on consumer products, since March 13th, keeping only targeted tariffs on specific sectors. This move was designed to prevent domestic price increases and show good faith ahead of the USMCA review. But not all sectors got the exemption. Specific industries faced brutal direct hits. Steel and aluminum. Trump imposed 25% tariffs in March 2025, then doubled them to 50% by June, according to RBC Economics tracking. Lumber, a 10% tariff on softwood in October, with no CUSMA exemption. Kitchen cabinets and furniture, 25% tariffs in October, scheduled to increase to 50% for cabinets and 30% for furniture on January 1st, 2026. That January 1st increase? Trump paused it at the last minute. On December 31st, 2025, the White House quietly announced a delay. According to Luke Elias, Vice President of the Canadian Kitchen Cabinet Association, speaking to CBC on January 2nd, yes, 50% is a relief. But our industry is still reeling from the 25%. You just can't mitigate that in the manufacturing environment overnight. The kitchen cabinet industry in Canada is worth $4.7 billion, with $600 million exported annually to the U.S. companies like Manitoba-based Elias Woodwork, which employs over 400 people and exports 80% of its production to America, saw all profit margins eliminated by the 25% tariffs, according to company president Ralph Fair's statements to media. The lumber sector tells a similar story. According to BC Business Analysis from December 2025, Canadian lumber production fell an additional 4% in 2025, already 20% below 2021 levels before Trump's tariffs hit. The combination of a weak housing market and punitive tariffs created what one industry association called the highest tariffs in recent history on Canadian wood products. Manufacturing faced mixed results. Auto production in Canada managed to stay near 2024 levels despite tariffs, but auto parts manufacturing declined approximately 3% according to RBC Economics data. The reason automakers survived? Many vehicles qualified for CUSMA compliance, avoiding tariffs. But small component manufacturers without resources to navigate compliance paperwork got hit hard. Here's where it gets even more painful for small businesses. On August 29, 2025, Trump eliminated the de minimis exemption, the rule allowing packages valued under $800 to enter tariff-free. According to BC Business Reporting, this led to the suspension of international postal deliveries between Canada and the U.S. Small Canadian exporters now face $8,200 per package in fees to sell to American consumers, making cross-border e-commerce effectively unviable for many small businesses. The inflation impact: Canada's annual inflation rate hit 2.4% in September 2025, above expectations, partially driven by higher prices on imported U.S. food and goods, according to multiple economic reports. The Canadian dollar weakened approximately 8% against the U.S. dollar over 2025, partly reflecting trade war uncertainty, though this ironically helped Canadian exporters remain competitive despite tariffs. Now here's the critical part. All of this: the tariffs, the exemptions, the industry pain, the diplomatic tensions, all of it hinges on what happens in July 2026. The USMCA includes a mandatory 6-year review clause. That review is scheduled for July 2026. Normally, this would be a technical exercise, officials checking if the agreement needs minor adjustments then extending it for another 16 years until the next review in 2036. But Trump has explicitly threatened to walk away from the agreement entirely if Canada and Mexico don't meet his demands. William Pellerin, the trade lawyer, stated in multiple interviews, "The 2026 CUSMA review is meant to be just that, a review, not a renegotiation. It's intended to be a chance for the parties to rectify a few issues with the agreement, but the Trump administration has signaled a willingness to walk away from the agreement if the U.S. doesn't secure certain concessions from Canada and Mexico." He added, "With ongoing tariffs already running against the spirit of the agreement, the CUSMA exemption itself absolutely could be at risk in talks next year." On December 19, 2025, according to Yahoo Finance reporting, the Office of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed that Canada and the U.S. will launch formal discussions in mid-January 2026 to review the free trade agreement. Dominic LeBlanc, Canada's point person for U.S. trade relations, will meet with U.S. counterparts to begin negotiations. Mark Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025 after Justin Trudeau resigned. Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, brings economic expertise but faces what he called in November speeches a rupture that requires a drastic reformulation of Canada's economic strategy. What's at stake? If the CUSMA collapses, that 90% duty-free trade disappears. Approximately $761.8 billion in goods trade between Canada and the U.S. in 2024, the goods portion of the $909.1 billion total, would suddenly face tariffs. The 35% blanket rate Trump maintains would apply to everything. Oxford economics Tony Stillo quantified the impact. If the CUSMA exemption were to end, Canada's economy would face longer-term scarring. The size of the economy would be lower for several years, probably permanently. RBC Economics goes further. Their modeling suggests Canadian GDP could contract 3 to 5% below baseline projections if the free trade agreement ends and full tariffs apply. That represents hundreds of billions in lost economic output and potentially hundreds of thousands of jobs. For context, the 2008 financial crisis caused Canada's GDP to contract 2.9% in 1 year. Losing CUSMA could be worse, with effects lasting years rather than quarters. The U.S. wouldn't escape unscathed. American automakers, Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, have spent decades integrating Canadian factories into their supply chains. Auto parts cross the border multiple times during manufacturing. Suddenly facing tariffs on each crossing would fundamentally break these systems. Ford CEO Jim Farley warned investors in January 2025, long-term, a 25% tariff across the Mexico and Canadian border will blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen. That was before Trump walked back auto tariffs for USMCA-compliant vehicles. If the agreement ends, even that exemption disappears. American consumers would feel it too. Canada is the largest source of U.S. crude oil imports. 4.1 million barrels per day in 2024, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. While Trump's tariffs on Canadian energy are currently 10%, lower than the 35% blanket rate, any disruption to this flow would impact gasoline prices across America. Canadian electricity exports power parts of New England and New York. Canadian lumber builds American homes. Canadian aluminum goes into American products. Tariffs increase costs for American businesses and consumers. Perhaps recognizing this, Trump made minor retreats. In November 2025, according to multiple sources including CNN Business and Global News, the Trump administration rolled back tariffs on coffee, beef, and other consumer staples facing sharp price increases. J.P. Morgan analysis cited in late December noted that U.S. businesses absorbed approximately 80% of tariff costs in 2025, rather than passing them to consumers. But analysts warn that share could flip to only 20% in 2026 as businesses exhaust their ability to absorb costs. Goldman Sachs economists estimated Trump's tariffs caused U.S. inflation to increase by 0.5 percentage points in 2025, bringing annual inflation to 2.7%, above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. They project tariffs could add another 0.3 percentage points in just the first half of 2026 if policies continue. This creates political pressure on Trump. He was elected in November 2024 partly on promises to reduce inflation, but his tariffs are contributing to the problem, and voters notice. CNN Business reporting from January 2026 notes that the last-minute tariff news dump, the December 31st furniture cabinet delay, suggests the administration has been rattled by the self-inflicted political vulnerabilities tariffs have wrought. With U.S. midterm elections in November 2026, Trump faces a calculation: maintain aggressive tariffs and risk voter backlash, or quietly retreat and admit the policy failed. Canada, meanwhile, pursues a diversification strategy. According to multiple sources, including Poder 360 and the Financial Times, Canada and Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, resumed free trade negotiations in October 2025 after years of stalemate. Canadian Minister Melanie Joly stated publicly that Canada is seeking new trade agreements around the world to diversify the economy and reduce dependence on the United States. Current Canada-Mercosur trade totals only, say, $15.8 billion annually, tiny compared to U.S. trade, but signing a comprehensive agreement would eliminate tariffs on up to 95% of products, creating new opportunities for Canadian agriculture, mining, and manufacturing exports. Canada also activated its Indo-Pacific strategy, deepening relationships with Japan, South Korea, India, and ASEAN nations. The Canada-EU CTA agreement, in provisional application, saw Canadian exports to Europe grow approximately 8% in 2025, partially compensating for U.S. market difficulties. Most symbolically, Canada's first LNG export terminal began shipping in 2025. The LNG Canada project in British Columbia shipped its first cargoes to Asia, marking Canada's debut as a global LNG exporter and reducing dependence on the U.S. market for natural gas. But diversification takes years, even decades, to meaningfully reduce U.S. dependency. No market can quickly absorb 75% of Canadian exports currently going to America. Diversification is insurance for the future, not a solution for 2026. The diplomatic relationship has deteriorated dramatically. An incident in October 2025 exemplifies the tension. Ontario Premier Doug Ford launched a $75 million advertising campaign in the United States featuring late President Ronald Reagan warning against trade wars. Trump exploded in fury, posting on social media, "Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated." Carney had to intervene, persuading Ford to pull the advertisements to resume talks. That a television commercial could freeze negotiations between allied nations shows how personal and volatile the relationship has become. Public reaction in Canada has been fierce. According to Swiss news agency Swiss Info reporting from February 2025, Canadian sports fans booed the U.S. national anthem at NBA and NHL games. Consumers literally turned U.S. products upside down on supermarket shelves to mark them for boycott. An app called Maple Scan was developed to help consumers identify and avoid American brands by scanning barcodes. Ontario's government-run liquor stores, LCBO, stopped selling American alcoholic beverages entirely, a $1 billion market for U.S. producers. Premier Doug Ford declared, "We didn't start this war, but we're going to win it." Google Trends data showed searches for Boycott USA spiking 180% globally after Trump's tariff announcements. The movement spread beyond Canada. Danish supermarkets placed special markers on shelves to highlight non-American products, and Tesla showrooms in Europe and Australia faced protests under the Tesla takedown movement, targeting Elon Musk for his support of Trump. Canadian tourism to the United States plummeted. Historically, about 25 million Canadian visits to the U.S. annually brought billions to American businesses, particularly in Florida, Arizona, California, and border states. In 2025, visits dropped an estimated 20% according to tourism industry data cited in media reports. Mayors of American border cities like Buffalo, Haines, Alaska, and Detroit expressed concern. Some organized protests waving Canadian flags, worried about local economic impacts from the souring relationship. The human dimension matters too. The expansion of the Safe Third Country Agreement, while satisfying Trump's border security demands, created humanitarian concerns. Reuters documented cases of asylum seekers returned to the U.S. by Canada, facing subsequent deportation to dangerous third countries. Advocacy groups like the Canadian Council for Refugees criticized the policy as compromising Canada's humanitarian values under American pressure. 300 miles of new fencing and barriers were installed along the Canada-U.S. border in 2025, particularly in the Quebec-New York corridor where the Roxham Road crossing point was closed. The longest undefended border in the world became increasingly militarized. So where does this leave us today, January 5th, 2026? In approximately 6 months, Canadian and American negotiators will sit down for the USMCA review in July. Everything we've discussed, the $909 billion in trade, the customer exemption protecting 90% of Canadian exports, the integrated supply chains, the jobs on both sides, all of it depends on that review's outcome. Trump has three broad options. Option 1, declare victory and extend the agreement. Trump could claim his tariff pressure forced Canada to improve border security, accept modifications to dairy quotas, or make other concessions. He declares he fixed NAFTA again, the agreement continues, and trade normalizes. Option 2, negotiate major changes. Trump could demand significant concessions, broader market access for U.S. agriculture, restrictions on Canadian industrial policies, changes to automotive rules of origin. This leads to months of contentious negotiations with uncertain outcome. Option 3, walk away. Trump announces the U.S. is withdrawing from USMCA, triggering the agreement's termination clause. After a 6-month notice period, the free trade agreement ends. Trade reverts to WTO rules, plus whatever tariffs Trump imposes. Each scenario has different timelines and impacts, but the clock is ticking. Formal talks begin mid-January, according to Carney's office. The July review deadline is mandatory, and Trump has shown he's willing to use extreme tactics, including threatening to exit treaties entirely as negotiating leverage. Canadian business leaders are watching nervously. The Business Council of Canada and provincial chambers of commerce emphasize that for 35 years, access to the U.S. market has been a fundamental value proposition for Canadian industry. Losing it would force wholesale restructuring of the economy. American companies are also concerned. Costco and other major importers have filed lawsuits challenging the legality of Trump's tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, that Trump invoked. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments in November 2025, with a decision expected in 2026, according to the Tax Policy Center's tariff tracker. If the court rules against Trump, he could be forced to refund up to $100 billion in collected tariff revenue, according to estimates from the National Economic Council. That legal uncertainty adds another layer to negotiations. Meanwhile, U.S. businesses paid $187 billion more in tariff revenue in 2025 than in 2024, a nearly 200% increase according to CNN Business Analysis. That money came from importers, who either absorbed the cost, reducing profits, or passed it to consumers, increasing prices. As 2026 progresses, more of that cost will reach American households. Trump's average tariff rate stands at 17.0% currently across all trading partners, according to the Tax Policy Center. If all announced policies take full effect, it would reach 21.0%, the highest since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley tariff that many economists blame for deepening the Great Depression. For Canada specifically, Stillo from Oxford Economics offers this baseline forecast for 2026, a renegotiation that leaves lower but ongoing U.S. tariffs on steel, aluminum, and agricultural industries in Canada. That would be a partial de-escalation, not a return to tariff-free trade, but better than the current situation. But Pellerin, the trade lawyer, cautions that the customer exemption itself absolutely could be at risk. If negotiators can't agree, or if Trump feels he's not getting sufficient concessions, the entire framework could collapse. The stakes extend beyond economics. This is a test of whether international agreements matter when one party doesn't want to honor them. It's a test of whether integrated supply chains built over decades can survive political volatility. It's a test of the U.S.-Canada alliance, the world's longest undefended border, the NORAD partnership, the historic cooperation between democracies. You now have the complete documented picture as of today, January 5th, 2026. Donald Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canada in February 2025, escalating to 35% by August. Approximately 90% of Canadian goods continued entering duty-free through CUSMA compliance exemptions. Specific sectors, steel, aluminum, lumber, furniture, cabinets, faced brutal direct tariffs with no exemption. Canada responded with border security measures, retaliatory tariffs that were later suspended, and a diversification strategy seeking new trading partners. Canadian consumers boycotted American products and destinations. The relationship between leaders deteriorated to threats of terminating all negotiations. In July 2026, the mandatory USMCA review occurs. If the agreement survives, trade can normalize. If it collapses, the largest integrated binational economy on Earth fractures, with consequences measured in hundreds of billions of dollars and potentially millions of jobs. The data is documented. The timeline is clear. What happens in the next 6 months will determine whether the Canada-US trade system, the foundation of North American prosperity for 3 decades, survives or breaks under the weight of Trump's tariff war.